You are standing on a dusty road in the Roman Empire, sometime in the early 1st century CE. The road stretches before you in an unnervingly straight line, stone blocks neatly aligned, ditches cut to drain the winter rains. Alongside it, mile markers carved from stone rise at regular intervals, each one bearing the distance to Rome. This is not an ordinary road. It is part of the cursus publicus, the imperial postal system, designed for the swift delivery of messages, reports, and orders across the empire. And on this road, trudging forward with steady determination, is a man whose profession might sound dull in the grandeur of Roman history. He is a courier, a postman of the empire. His life is not recorded in marble or epic poetry. No triumphal arch honors his miles of walking or his sleepless nights spent waiting for a horse. Yet without him and others like him, the empire could not have held together. The Roman postman's task was simple in theory: carry information from one place to another. But in practice, this task was monumental. Imagine letters sent from governors in Gaul to the Senate in Rome, instructions from the emperor dispatched to distant legions along the Danube, or accounts of tax receipts carried from provincial treasurers to the capital. These fragile pieces of papyrus or parchment meant the difference between order and chaos. Augustus, the first emperor, is credited with formalizing the cursus publicus. Before him, messages were carried by private slaves or military messengers, but Augustus recognized that an empire of provinces stretching from Spain to Syria required something more reliable. Thus, a network of stations mutations for changing horses and mansions for overnight lodging was created along major roads. The stations were placed about every 8 to 12 Roman miles. Couriers could stop, exchange tired horses for fresh ones, or hand the message to another rider who would continue the journey. In this way, a message could cross hundreds of miles in days rather than weeks. The couriers themselves, though vital, were often anonymous figures. They worked under the authority of local officials and were subject to imperial regulations about speed, accuracy, and secrecy. Imagine now the Roman postman setting out at dawn. His sandals are strapped tightly, his satchel slung across his shoulder. Inside the satchel he carries wax tablets, papyrus scrolls, and sometimes small packets sealed with twine and wax stamps. The satchel is heavy, not because of the paper, but because of the responsibility. The road before him is not empty. Traders, soldiers, peasants, and pilgrims walk beside carts pulled by oxen. The courier moves past them with an air of urgency. He may carry an imperial diploma, a bronze tablet granting him the right to demand fresh horses at stations, to receive food and lodging at mansions, and to travel without interference. Without this official license, he would be just another traveler. With it, he is a representative of Rome itself. Travel was not easy. Dust caked the skin in summer, while rains turned the road into a slick hazard in winter. Bandits lurked in forests, and in some provinces, rebellious locals threatened violence. To carry a message from Rome to a frontier post in Britain might take weeks, through uncertain terrain, often on roads damaged by weather or war. The messages he carried were themselves fragile. Wax tablets, reusable and practical, could record short notes or official memoranda. Papyrus scrolls, imported from Egypt, were costly and prone to tearing. Seals of wax or clay prevented tampering, but a dishonest courier could still read a message. That is why emperors often used codes or relied on trusted freedmen for sensitive letters. A postman's load was not only letters. He might also carry ledgers of tax receipts, inventories of supplies, or census reports. These were dull documents, filled with numbers, lists of names, and quantities of grain. Yet such records kept the empire running. Imagine a census tablet listing the number of men eligible for military service in a small Gallic town. It may seem trivial, but without it, recruitment could falter, and an entire legion might lack the soldiers it needed. At midday, the courier stops at a mutatio. Stable hands rush to bring him a fresh horse. He eats a small meal of bread, cheese, and watered wine, while officials stamp his travel papers. Then, without lingering, he mounts and continues. The roads were built for such efficiency, paved with stone, crowned in the middle to allow water to drain, and lined with ditches. They were marvels of engineering. Surveyors measured them carefully, ensuring the shortest routes. Every mile marker reassured the courier of his progress. Yet the monotony of endless miles could wear down even the strongest spirit. At night he reaches a mansio. Here he may rest, sharing a room with other travelers, his satchel kept close at his side. Lamps flicker on the plastered walls and the smell of oil and sweat fills the air. He may hear distant conversations in Greek, Latin, or the tongues of provincial merchants. Sleep comes lightly, for at dawn he must continue again. This system, mundane as it may sound, held the empire together. Orders to march, news of uprisings, records of grain harvests all depended on the reliability of the couriers. A delay of days could mean disaster, a legion ambushed before reinforcements arrived, a governor acting without updated instructions, or a famine left unrelieved because the request for grain ships never reached Rome in time. The empire was vast, and its unity was as fragile as the papyrus scrolls carried in the courier's satchel. The postman may not have been a senator, general, or poet, but in his quiet way, he shaped the course of Roman history. As you picture him trudging along the Roman road, dust rising at each step, you may wonder, what kept these couriers going? Was it loyalty to the emperor, fear of punishment, or simply the dull rhythm of a job that needed to be done? And more intriguingly, what happened when the system failed, when letters were lost, couriers delayed, or messages deliberately altered? As the Roman Empire expanded, so did the burden on the cursus publicus. What began under Augustus as a streamlined, controlled network of official couriers and stations soon faced the weight of a growing bureaucracy. Provinces multiplied. Governors became more distant. The roads stretched across thousands of miles, from the misty isles of Britannia to the deserts of Arabia Petrea. With this expansion came complexity. Each region had its own needs, its own priorities. Couriers weren't merely delivering single letters anymore, they were carrying sacks of messages between multiple offices, transferring scrolls, wax tablets, receipts, orders, and confidential reports, all of which had to be logged and confirmed. Mistakes became inevitable, delays even more so. And with every added layer of paperwork came an increased opportunity for miscommunication, inefficiency, and corruption. The cursus publicus was nominally under the control of the imperial government, but in practice, it depended on local governors, landowners, and officials to manage each leg of the journey. In a well-governed province, the post system functioned with surprising speed. But in troubled regions such as the turbulent frontier zones or areas of civil unrest, the system frayed. Some local governors, feeling isolated from Rome's supervision, began to abuse the system. Horses meant for imperial couriers were commandeered for personal use. Stations were underfunded, staff unpaid. Food rations, intended for weary messengers, were sold off or withheld. A postman might arrive at a mansio with his diploma in hand, only to be turned away for lack of bribes. Others used the system for personal advantage. Messages between private estates were sometimes smuggled into official deliveries. Imperial riders were sent to deliver letters not of war or taxes, but of gossip, family business, or land disputes. And yet, so entrenched was the system's necessity that Rome tolerated a certain level of misuse so long as the essential communications continued to flow. To understand the stakes, you must imagine what a delayed message could mean in the Roman world. Take, for example, a military dispatch. A governor in Hispania might receive word of a local tribal rebellion. His letter to Rome, carried by courier, asks for reinforcement troops. But if the message is delayed, held up at a station for a day, or misrouted through a corrupt official, the reinforcements may arrive too late. An entire cohort could be wiped out. A province could fall into chaos. Or consider the census. The census populi, the recording of citizens, their families, and their property was a massive undertaking. The numbers were reported by local officials, copied meticulously onto scrolls, and delivered to Rome. Errors or delays in this system could lead to the wrong amount of taxes being levied. Too little, and the empire loses vital funds. Too much, and unrest brews in the provinces. The postman, trudging along the Via Aurelia or the Via Ignatia, may not have known the exact content of what he carried, but he certainly knew that if he dropped the scroll into a stream or failed to arrive on time, the consequences could be severe. Not only for him, but for the region he passed through. Rome took the cursus publicus seriously. While many couriers were low-status officials or freedmen, they were subject to imperial discipline. A missing message could result in flogging, imprisonment, or worse. There are even records of couriers being executed for deliberately tampering with communications, an act considered treason if it interfered with imperial authority. But failure didn't always come from malice. Sometimes the courier simply fell ill. Sometimes his horse died. Roads washed out, bridges collapsed, or bandits attacked the convoy. Rome tried to account for these realities. Backup couriers were stationed along critical routes. Messages were sometimes duplicated and sent by parallel paths. Still, the system was only as strong as its slowest leg. One case recorded in the annals of the province of Syria tells of a delayed grain report that failed to reach the governor in Antioch. The result? A food shortage left unresolved for nearly 2 weeks. Riots broke out in the marketplace. Temples were looted. The imperial response came too late, and the courier responsible was never found. Let us return again to the Roman postman, not as an abstract symbol of bureaucracy, but as a man. He begins his journey near Lugdunum, modern-day Lyon, heading south toward Massilia, then by ship to Rome. He passes toll gates and tax checkpoints, where even officials must argue over fees and permissions. He sleeps in overcrowded inns, sometimes in the stables when beds are full. In towns, people treat him with suspicion. He carries official orders, after all, and no one trusts an imperial courier to bring good news. Sometimes he is offered bribes. Please take this message to my cousin in Rome. It's urgent. No need to mention it to your overseer. Other times he is met with threats. Deliver this scroll exactly as written or something unfortunate might happen to your next horse. He cannot afford delay. His diploma gives him rights, yes, but also binds him to duty. If he is caught misusing it, even for a good reason, punishment is severe. And yet, in a system rife with corruption, even the most honest postman must occasionally make compromises. The imperial court in Rome knew all too well that information was power. To control information, you had to control the routes it traveled. By the time of Hadrian and Marcus Aurelius, the role of the courier had become not just one of delivery, but surveillance. Some couriers were instructed to observe and report on what they saw: military movements, prices in markets, attitudes in the provinces. They became the empire's eyes as well as its messengers. Occasionally, letters were copied in secret before being delivered. Officials in Rome might read the messages sent between governors, gathering intelligence without their knowledge. This made trust even more elusive. Who could say whether a courier truly worked for the cursus publicus or for the emperor's private service? And for the courier himself, who could be trusted among the provincial officials and station masters he encountered? By the late 3rd century CE, cracks had begun to show in the system. The empire, now overextended, suffered from repeated invasions, economic collapse, and internal strife. Funding for the postal system dried up. Stations were abandoned. Horses went unfed. The Emperor Diocletian attempted reforms, dividing the empire, reorganizing administration, and trying to restore discipline to the cursus publicus. But even he could not halt the system's decay. As the postmen trudged along crumbling roads, they carried not just letters, but the weight of an empire on the brink. In the end, The Roman postman was more than just a man on a horse. He was a symbol of the empire's ambition to govern at distance, to communicate across mountains, deserts, and seas. But as the bureaucracy grew bloated and trust eroded, you may wonder, how long can any system endure when it depends on so many fragile hands and so many silent miles? It is the year 425 CE. The Western Roman Empire, once the world's greatest power, is now a fractured shell of itself. Barbarians press at the borders. Civil wars drain the treasury. The legions are underpaid, if paid at all. And yet, somewhere along a cracked and faded Roman road in northern Italy, a courier still rides. His tunic is patched, his horse underfed, and his satchel contains only 2 letters. One is a military dispatch from the Magister Militum in Ravenna to a general near Mediolanum. The other is a census update from a region that has not seen a functioning governor in months. The road beneath him was once a marvel, laid by legions and measured by Roman surveyors. Now it is littered with debris, overgrown at the edges, and in many places interrupted by crude barricades. Still, he rides because even as the empire crumbles, the cursus publicus moves forward, out of habit if not hope. By the 5th century, the Roman postal system was deteriorating rapidly. The Eastern Empire, Byzantium, would maintain a semblance of order for some time, but the Western Empire system had become unreliable, poorly funded, and increasingly irrelevant. Post stations were abandoned due to raids or lack of funds. Horses starved or were requisitioned by local warlords. Many mutations became little more than collapsed barns, their walls blackened by weather or arson. The once glorious mansions were reduced to little more than waypoints for thieves and deserters. The postmen who still rode, those few who hadn't taken up farming, mercenary work, or gone missing, did so on worn-out roads with no guarantee of support. Their travel permits were ignored, their seals unrecognized, their missions increasingly symbolic. But the need for communication remained. If anything, in times of chaos, communication became more vital. Governors, bishops, military commanders, and emperors all depended on information. Even if the system faltered, the impulse to sustain it never quite disappeared. What did it mean to be a Roman postman in an age when Rome itself was barely Roman anymore? When the emperors were puppets, often murdered or exiled, and generals held real power. You, the listener, might picture him again, his sandals caked in the red mud of the Po Valley, his cloak frayed at the hem. He carries the imperial diploma, but it's cracked and faded. Many stations no longer accept it. A local landlord might look at it and laugh, or worse, confiscate it and send him away. The postman now navigates a world where trust is gone. Each province acts like a kingdom. Latin is still spoken, but local dialects dominate. The unity of the empire is more memory than reality. And still the postman walks or rides. He avoids brigands, crosses makeshift bridges, and barters for shelter. He reads faces for danger, listens at taverns for rumors, and sleeps with one eye open. He has no weapons but a short knife, no wealth but the contents of his satchel. He is anonymous, forgettable, and yet vital. Without him, news of Visigothic movements does not reach commanders. Without him, food requisition requests never arrive. Without him, the idea of Rome fades more rapidly from the outer provinces. One of the last known imperial orders sent via the cursus publicus in the west was a desperate request from a regional administrator in Gaul, asking for soldiers to defend against a Frankish incursion. The reply, it is believed, never reached him. Somewhere along the way, perhaps near a broken bridge or a looted station, the courier disappeared. The reply was never recorded in the provincial archive. Such vanishings were no longer rare. Letters were lost. Carriers simply gave up. Others died in ambushes or were absorbed into the very barbarian groups they were meant to report on. Still others sold the contents of their satchels to interested parties, rival generals, warlords, or traders seeking advantage. The age of orderly communication had ended. The postman, once a symbol of imperial reach and stability, had become a ghost, a man traveling through ruins, carrying words that fewer and fewer people could read, let alone act upon. When the city of Rome itself was sacked in 410 by the Visigoths under Alaric, it shocked the ancient world. But the event, though monumental, did not immediately erase the systems Rome had built. In fact, parts of the cursus publicus continued operating in some form for decades after. A courier might still travel between key cities Rome, Ravenna, Mediolanum, Aquileia even as imperial legitimacy eroded. These last postmen bore the illusion of normalcy. Letters still bore official seals. Orders were still given. But everyone knew the truth. The empire no longer ruled in any meaningful way. And yet for the man walking the roads little had changed. His days still began with the loading of satchels. His nights still ended with sleep in a roadside station, a barn, or beneath the stars. His feet still hurt. The roads were still long. The job still had to be done. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 CE, much of the infrastructure collapsed or was repurposed, but the memory of the Roman post endured. In the Eastern Roman Empire, what we call Byzantium, the postal service survived in modified form for several more centuries. The concept of an organized imperial post, with stages, permits, and sealed messages, would influence systems in Persia, the Islamic caliphates, and medieval Europe. The Franks under Charlemagne adopted a courier network reminiscent of the cursus publicus. The Ottomans, centuries later, built stations and roads that mirrored the logic of Rome. Even modern mail systems, military couriers, express delivery routes, standardized permissions owe something to the Roman experiment. The courier himself disappeared, but the role he filled lived on. His sandals were replaced with stirrups, his wax tablets with paper envelopes, his empire with kingdoms and republics, but the journey continued. We rarely remember the Roman postman. No statue honors his name. No epic recounts his bravery. But without him, the empire could not function. Every decision, every campaign, every census and law depended on the delivery of information. He represents not the glory of conquest or the elegance of marble columns, but the dull, daily work that kept civilization stitched together. He was the thread that bound provinces to capital, generals to governors, citizens to state. You may think of history as great battles, emperors, and revolutions. But history is also a man walking 25 miles in the rain, carrying a letter on which an entire province's fate may depend, and not knowing if anyone will be there to read it when he arrives. As the empire fell away around him, did the Roman postman realize he was delivering messages for a world that no longer existed? Did he ever pause at a mile marker, glance at the horizon, and wonder, who is left to listen? You are in Athens 5th century BCE, not the shining temples of the Acropolis or the crowded markets of the Agora, but just below the Phoenix Hill, where citizens gather to debate and vote. It is early morning. The air is still cool, and the streets are not yet filled with the clang of metal or the cries of merchants. Inside a dark stone building tucked behind the assembly, a man leans over a simple device. It is not impressive, just two clay vessels and a narrow spout connecting them. Water drips from one vessel to the other, slowly, predictably. That man is a clepsydra keeper. His role is not glorious. He is neither orator nor judge, not even a clerk. But he controls something sacred, time. Time for speeches, time for trials, time for votes. And in this democracy built on argument and reason, time is power. The clepsydra, literally water thief, was one of the earliest timekeeping devices in human history. Unlike sundials, which relied on the sun's path, the clepsydra could be used indoors at night or during cloudy weather. The Athenian version used two clay vessels, one above, one below, connected by a narrow tube or spout. As water flowed from the top to the bottom, it marked the passage of time. The size of the vessel, the width of the spout, and the water's viscosity all contributed to the timing's accuracy or its lack thereof. In Athens, clepsydra were used primarily in courts and public meetings. A man accused of a crime might have one vessel's worth of time to make his case. A politician at the assembly had a specific number of water intervals to convince his fellow citizens, and overseeing it all was the clepsydra keeper. The keeper's day began early, before the courts opened. He would clean the vessels, check for cracks, and inspect the flow spout for blockages. Even a small bit of sediment could cause the timing to slow, unacceptable in a system where justice depended on equal access to time. He measured the water carefully, filling it to prescribed lines etched into the clay. The water had to be clean, and at the right temperature cold water flowed slower, warm water faster. He adjusted accordingly. And then he waited. The vessel began to drain drip by drip as citizens made their cases. He watched with practiced eyes, standing silently at the edge of the speaker's platform. When the water ran out, he raised his hand or struck a small bell. Time was up. His job was to be impartial, unmovable, invisible, and utterly consistent. In a modern democracy, we think of balance as something maintained through laws and elections. But in classical Athens, it was maintained by time. Every free male citizen had the right to speak, but none had the right to speak endlessly. The clepsydra ensured fairness in discourse. A wealthy aristocrat could not outtalk a poor farmer simply because he had more education or a louder voice. They were both bound by the same dripping water. In trials, the system was even more rigid. Each side was allotted a fixed amount of time measured not in minutes but in water units. If a speaker paused or was interrupted, the water was sometimes stopped with a cork, but often it simply kept flowing. Silence counted against you. For the accused, this was terrifying. There were no lawyers, only self-defense. Every second of your allotted water was a chance to sway the jury, and once the water ran out, so did your voice. Consider the trial of Socrates in 399 BCE. Though the exact structure of his hearing remains debated, we know that the clepsydra played a role. Socrates defended himself before hundreds of jurors, all drawn by lot. He likely had 2 or 3 full vessels of time. Imagine him standing before the crowd, the water dripping silently nearby as he refused to apologize, refused to beg. The keeper, perhaps, looked on without emotion. When the last drop fell, Socrates was done. Time had decided. And as his sentence was pronounced death by hemlock, the keeper cleaned the vessel, refilled it, and prepared for the next case. Time in ancient Athens was not digital nor even mechanical. It was audible and visible. Citizens heard it drip, 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 and watched it flow. This had psychological consequences. Speakers would rush or pause strategically. Some stared at the vessel while talking. Others ignored it altogether, only to be cut off mid-sentence. The clepsydra didn't care. It had no regard for importance or emotion. And neither did the keeper. His role was to resist sympathy, ignore rhetoric, and simply uphold the passage of time. In that sense, he was a more constant force than the fickle crowds of Athens. The clepsydra keeper lived modestly. He was paid from public funds, though not generously. His tools were simple: vessels, water, a sponge or cloth, sometimes a bell. He may have lived near the court buildings, possibly in shared housing with other civic workers. In the evenings, he might visit the agora, buy bread or olives, and listen to the debates of the day. But he never took part. His role was not to speak, but to regulate speech. He was both essential and invisible, a bureaucrat in a city that celebrated voices, but only when measured. As you picture the clepsydra's slow dripping in a crowded courtroom, think of the silence that follows the last drop. The voice cuts off, the crowd murmurs, and the keeper steps forward to empty the vessel. What power lies in being the one who measures another man's voice, and who decides, without a word, when he must stop speaking? The night is warm and windless in Athens. The stars are out, the torches are lit, and the marble steps of the Areopagus Athens, ancient hill of judgment, glow faintly in the firelight. But inside the court chamber there is no warmth. It is cold, quiet, and tense. A clepsydra sits near the magistrate's seat, a large clay vessel atop a wooden stand. A crowd of jurors listens as a citizen stands to defend himself. His voice quivers. He knows he is innocent, or so he believes, but the law demands proof, and the court demands brevity. At the edge of the chamber stands the clepsydra keeper. He leans in slightly, uncorks the vessel, and water begins to trickle down the spout. The trial has begun. The man's fate, whether exile, confiscation of property, or death, is now measured in drips. Though most famous for its use in Athenian courts, the clepsydra was used throughout public life in ancient Greece. Anywhere fairness and order were valued, the water clock followed. In the ecclesia, the Athenian assembly, speakers were limited in time by water clocks. Some matters of state, such as declarations of war, debates on grain prices, or deliberations on treaties, could not be rushed. But they also could not be allowed to ramble unchecked. Even famed orators like Pericles or Demosthenes were subject to the drip. The clepsydra was also present in more spiritual and ritual settings. During religious ceremonies, it helped structure prayers or sacrifices that needed to be performed in a timed sequence. Priests may have used it quietly in temples to measure purification periods, or to ensure hymns were not rushed or extended beyond tradition. It even played a role in education. Students of rhetoric, law, and public speaking were taught to pace their arguments according to the clepsydra. Timing was not just an art, it was a civic skill. By the later classical period, 4th century BCE, clepsydra keepers were no longer viewed as mere servants. Their precision was respected. A good keeper could maintain flow even in changing temperatures. He knew which water jugs leaked, which spouts needed extra cleaning, and how to detect when someone tampered with the equipment. Some keepers began keeping small notebooks, wax tablets with marks for timing intervals and notes on trials. They weren't judges, but they remembered outcomes. They could recall who had spoken too long, who had begged for more time, who had accused them of error. There are even records of disputes over clepsydra themselves. One speaker complained that his time ran out too quickly. A counter-speaker insisted it was fair. The magistrate called upon the clepsydra keeper, who gave quiet but firm testimony. The water flowed as expected. The verdict stood. This shows the subtle power of the keeper, not in deciding law, but in defending the legitimacy of time itself. Time was never a neutral concept. In a court where every man defended himself, there was immense pressure to make every drop count. Some defendants accused the keepers of bias, especially when the water seemed to run faster than expected. But the real tension came from the impossibility of fairness in an analog world. Cold water flowed slower, and a cool morning trial might allow more time than a hot afternoon one. A clogged spout could ruin a carefully timed speech. The keepers were trained to adjust for these variables, but mistakes happened. And when they did, the consequences could be enormous. Imagine being sentenced to exile or death, and believing your fate was sealed not by justice, but by a poorly flowing jug. To combat this, Athens developed standard vessel sizes, sometimes with inscriptions showing the volume or duration. But standardization could only go so far. In the end, the keeper's reputation mattered more than the clay he worked with. Athenian rhetoric, the art of public speaking, developed under the constant gaze of the clepsydra. The very style of speech changed because of it. Long, flowing sentences gave way to tight arguments. Philosophers like Aristotle later reflected on the ideal structure of persuasive speech: clarity, brevity, rhythm. The best speakers knew how to make a powerful case in a short time. They learned to use silence strategically, to breathe carefully, and to anticipate interruptions. Some trained with simulated clepsydry, learning to craft speeches that matched specific durations. Even playwrights and poets felt the influence. In festival competitions, plays were timed. Dramatic packing sometimes borrowed from the structure of legal or political speeches, acts that rose and fell in rhythm with expected time blocks. All of this stemmed from the clepsydra. A tool meant to regulate became a force that shaped culture. Other Greek cities adopted the clepsydra and some adapted it further. The Spartans used it in more militarized settings, often for drills or shifts. In Thebes and Corinth, temples used it in rituals. By the Hellenistic period, more advanced water clocks appeared. Engineers like Ctesibius of Alexandria, 3rd century BCE, created intricate clepsydry with floating indicators, gears, and even automated figures. Some designs were accurate enough to compete with later medieval mechanical clocks. Still, in most places, the simple vessel persisted. It was cheap, repairable, and consistent enough for daily use. And behind it all, there was always a human being the keeper responsible for refilling, regulating, and explaining its flow. It's easy to overlook the clepsydra keeper when recounting the story of Athenian democracy or Hellenic science. But behind every speech, every vote, every sentence passed in the courts, he stood silently. He was not immortalized in statues or mentioned in epic poetry. Yet he guarded the one thing that every citizen needed equally: measured time. Not because he was powerful, but because without someone to ensure fairness, even democracy becomes noise. As the keeper watches the water run dry during a heated court case, the speaker's final words hang in the air, unfinished. The crowd stirs. The jury prepares to vote. In our modern world, time is everywhere. It blinks at us from screens, ticks from watches, and syncs across satellites. But for much of ancient history, time was not measured with precision, it was felt. In shadows on stone, in sunrises and sunsets, in meals and prayers. And in one simple, dripping vessel. The clepsydra, born of utility and refined through necessity, represented one of the earliest human attempts to regulate time in a repeatable, objective way. Yet, as Athens declined and the Roman world rose, the clepsydra, and the keepers who once governed it, began to fade from view. But before that decline, the water clock would reach its pinnacle not in a courtroom, but in the hands of tinkerers, astronomers, and engineers. By the 3rd century BCE, Greece was no longer a land of independent city-states, but a fractured territory overshadowed by the rising power of Macedon and later Rome. Yet it was during this twilight period of Hellenic influence that technological curiosity blossomed. In Alexandria, under the rule of the Ptolemies, scholars began experimenting with more elaborate timekeeping devices. Chief among them was Ctesibius, an inventor and engineer who worked at the famous Library of Alexandria. Ctesibius took the humble clepsydra and transformed it. Instead of simply watching water drip from one pot to another, he devised a system where a rising float marked the water level, moving a pointer to indicate elapsed time. Gears, pulleys, and siphons turned the device from a passive vessel into an active machine. Some of these water clocks chimed at intervals. Others featured miniature automata, small figures that moved or rang bells. One design even displayed rotating star maps to simulate the movement of celestial bodies. What was once a tool of law had become a symbol of scientific ingenuity. As these devices grew more complex, the role of the clepsydra keeper evolved. He was no longer simply a man who measured and refilled. He became a technician, a calibrator, and in some cases, a craftsman. In Alexandria and other major centers like Pergamon and Antioch, clockmakers were valued members of court society. They were consulted not only for ceremonial timekeeping, but also for astronomical studies and engineering projects. One royal timekeeper reportedly created a clepsydra that adjusted for seasonal water flow by compensating for evaporation, rates an early recognition of the natural world's influence on mechanics. Though still rooted in simplicity, the water clock had become an object of art and intellect. When the Romans came to dominate the Greek world, they adopted many of its systems, language, architecture, military formations, and even some elements of its bureaucracy. But when it came to timekeeping, the Romans were more pragmatic. They preferred sundials for civic use and sandglasses, hourglasses, for personal use. The clepsydra was retained in some courts and religious ceremonies, but it gradually fell out of widespread public use. Where the Greeks saw time as something to regulate civic virtue, the Romans often saw it as a tool of imperial control. The clepsydra's democratic roots held less appeal in a world ruled by emperors. Still, in temples and some scientific circles, the clepsydra lingered. Pliny the Elder mentions them briefly. Vitruvius describes a few designs, but overall, they belong to a bygone intellectual era quietly ticking away in corners as Rome thundered on. With the decline of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century CE, Europe entered a period where the measurement of time receded into obscurity. Clepsydræ were replaced not by better clocks, but by the absence of clocks. In many places, timekeeping returned to what it had been centuries earlier, reliant on the sun, bells from monasteries, and instinct. The artisan keepers of water clocks faded from record. Their tools broke. Their knowledge was not passed on. The Islamic Golden Age, 8th–13th centuries, would later revive and greatly advance the clepsydra, especially in the work of scholars like Al-Jazari, who designed elaborate water-powered devices for palaces and mosques. But these were distant echoes of the original Greek vessel, now refined, mechanized, and repurposed. In Europe, the mechanical escapement of the 14th century finally pushed the water clock aside for good. The clepsydra keeper left behind almost nothing: no biographies, no tomb inscriptions, no surviving tools. Their lives were routine, anonymous, and essential. They were not philosophers or generals, but they shaped the conditions under which those men spoke and ruled. They were time stewards in an age before gears. And when they disappeared, so too did a kind of trust, the belief that fairness could be seen, heard, and measured in something as elemental as dripping water. Today, in museums across the world, you may find fragments of ancient clepsydræ, a cracked clay jug, a vessel with a faint line indicating full, a hollow spout calcified from centuries of rest. Rarely do we notice these pieces. Fewer still recognize them as artifacts of governance, of justice, of argument. But that is what they were. The ancient courtroom was not ruled by emotion or persuasion alone, it was ruled by time. And time in that world was a physical presence. It dripped, it echoed in chambers, it silenced men. There is something profound about that, a reminder that democracy once relied not on microphones and procedural rules, but on the slow, steady measure of water flowing through clay. As the last clepsydra keeper packs up his vessels and retires from a job no one will ever write down, you might wonder, when did we stop measuring justice by drips of water, and what did we lose when we did? It is just before sunrise in a small English village, sometime in the 12th century. The mist still clings to the damp grass, and the river beside the mill murmurs steadily as it has for centuries. A wooden wheel creaks into motion, pushed by the gentle force of water flowing down the mill race. Inside the mill, the air smells of damp grain, wet wood, and stone dust. The miller stokes a small lamp and stretches his back. He's already been awake for over an hour, checking the chute, adjusting the dam, greasing the axle. The first sacks of barley and rye arrived before dawn, dropped off by tenants who are required by custom or obligation to grind their grain here. The grindstones are heavy, ancient things. One turns while the other stays fixed, Between them, grain becomes flour, slowly, rhythmically, endlessly. And for the next 12 hours, that is what this man will oversee. The work is neither glorious nor particularly loud. But without it, no bread would rise, no pottage would thicken, no armies would march. He is the miller, and his tool is the millstone, the quiet, gritty heart of medieval life. The medieval mill was a marvel of simple but effective engineering. The primary innovation was not just the millstone itself, which had existed for millennia, but the use of mechanical power to turn it. In earlier ages, people ground grain by hand using querns, small, handheld stones. It was back-breaking, time-consuming work. But sometime in the late Roman period and into the early medieval era, water power began to take hold. By the 12th century, watermills were common throughout Europe. Some were small, just a wooden shed by a stream, while others were more complex, with vertical water wheels, gears, and levers to regulate the flow of water and the speed of the grind. The grindstones themselves were carefully sourced. Not just any rock would do. The best were burrstones from France, porous and hard, ideal for keeping a sharp cutting surface. Millers guarded these stones jealously. They were not easily replaced. A medieval miller's life was dictated by the rhythm of his stones. He would rise early to inspect the gear mechanisms, ensuring nothing was misaligned from the night's settling. The water wheel had to be freed of debris, especially in autumn when leaves and twigs could choke the race. Once the first peasant arrived with a sack of grain, the process began. Grain was poured into the hopper, trickled down through the shoe, a wooden chute, and fed between the stones. As the upper millstone, called the runner stone, turned, it sheared the grain against the stationary bedstone. The process had to be monitored constantly. Too fast and the grain would scorch from friction. Too slow and it wouldn't grind fine enough. Moisture, wind, even temperature could affect the output. Dust filled the air, coating the miller's clothes, beard, and lungs. He wore a leather apron and sometimes a cloth over his mouth, but there was no escaping the fine powder of ground grain. And yet this dust was also wealth. In medieval society, milling was often a monopoly. Lords, monasteries, or manorial estates controlled the local mills, and tenants were required to use them. They could not grind grain at home under penalty of fine or confiscation. This meant the miller sat in a powerful, if precarious, position. He collected a portion of the flour as payment, called the multure, usually about 1/16 of the total grain. Over time, this added up. Millers could become wealthy compared to their neighbors. But this also made them deeply mistrusted. Many villagers suspected millers of taking more than their fair share, secretly increasing the multure, or tampering with the weights. Some hid extra flour under the floorboards or wore false pockets. Others greased the measuring scoop so flour would stick. In literature and folklore, the miller is often portrayed as sly, corpulent, and morally ambiguous, a necessary figure, but not an entirely respected one. Millstones did not last forever. Every few weeks, the miller had to dress the stones, sharpening and regrooving them to maintain the cutting surface. This was painstaking work, requiring precision and skill. One slip of the pick could ruin a stone. There were also real dangers in the mill. Stones could crack or burst, especially if foreign objects like nails or stones were mixed in with the grain. A shattered millstone could kill a man or destroy the mill's mechanisms. Then there was fire. The combination of flour dust and wooden gears created an explosive environment. A single spark from friction or a dropped lantern could ignite a deadly blaze. Thus, the miller was both craftsman and custodian, engineer and fire warden. Despite suspicion, the mill was a central gathering place. It was where villagers exchanged news, children played near the race, and elders gossiped under the eaves. Women often came to deliver grain and collect flour, carrying the weighty sacks in baskets balanced on their hips. Sometimes they waited hours in line, chatting and complaining in equal measure. During harvest, the mill might run day and night. Lanterns flickered through the windows until dawn. The sound of grinding became as common as birdsong. And when famine struck, or taxes rose, or war came, the absence of grinding stones echoed loudly. A silent mill was a sign of hardship, or worse. As the miller scrapes the last bit of flour from beneath the stones, he looks up at the wooden wheel still turning slowly. Outside, another sack of barley arrives, and another day begins. It's not a glamorous life, but it is essential. And so you may wonder, in a world built on grain and bread, was there ever a time when the man who turned the stones was truly powerless? It's midday now, and the sun cuts sharp beams through the slats in the mill wall. Dust dances in the air, floating like ash from a fire. Inside, the miller wipes his brow with a flour-coated cloth. The grindstones turn steadily, but outside, a steward from the manor waits, arms folded, eyes narrowed. He's here to inspect the mill, check the weights, and ensure that the lord's share the multure is properly collected. The miller forces a half-smile, but tension simmers. Behind the rhythm of the wheel lies an ever-present truth. The mill may feed the village, but it also fuels a feudal economy where the boundaries of labor, loyalty, and law blur beneath a fine layer of flour. In much of medieval Europe, especially in the feudal West, mills were not private enterprises, they were part of the lord's holdings. Building a mill required capital, land, and legal permission. As a result, mills were established by landowners, noblemen, and monasteries. Once built, the mill became a banal right, an obligation imposed upon tenants to use the lord's mill, even if a personal hand quern sat unused at home. The logic was economic: consolidating grain processing meant a cut of every harvest. The law was strict. Tenants caught grinding grain at home could face fines, confiscation, or even corporal punishment. Millers often reported such infractions partly out of duty, partly out of self-interest. But this system bred resentment. Villagers felt trapped. The miller became a symbol of both daily necessity and feudal control, a man who served the bread and the hand that taxed it. Millers, by the very nature of their work, operated in ambiguity. Only they understood the mechanisms. Only they handled the scales, measured the multure, and inspected the flour. This imbalance of knowledge, coupled with their relative economic stability, led to one of the most enduring stereotypes of the Middle Ages: the dishonest miller. In Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, the miller is loud, lewd, and cheats customers by stealing corn and taking threefold toll. This image was not limited to literature, it appeared in sermons, songs, and village folklore. Even the church took notice. Canon law occasionally forbade millers from holding certain religious offices, citing frequent accusations of dishonesty. And in some towns, millers were required to submit to regular inspections or to install devices that marked each measure of flour produced. Still, suspicions endured. The sound of grinding was as much a reassurance of daily life as it was a reminder of quiet exploitation. Despite being commoners, millers held a form of technical power rare in rural society. They understood gear ratios, water levels, stone maintenance, and mechanical alignment. A mill that ground too hot could spoil grain. A poorly dressed stone could waste flour. Millers could intentionally slow the process to favor certain clients, or forget to pass on the full amount of flour to those they disliked. In winter, when water froze or the flow slowed to a trickle, the miller's decisions about who to serve first became matters of local politics. A miller could curry favor, settle grudges, or strike quiet deals with innkeepers and bakers. And unlike farmers who worked under the open sky, the miller worked behind closed doors. He controlled the rhythm, the pace, and the output. The mill was his domain, dull, dusty, but filled with quiet leverage. Monasteries often owned and operated mills. Their monks, literate and organized, saw mills as revenue streams and sources of community control. In these cases, millers were employees of the church, but even under monastic authority, tensions persisted. Lay millers accused monks of skimming profits. Monks accused millers of cheating. Disputes often ended in manorial court or ecclesiastical inquiry. Interestingly, millstones themselves became religious symbols. In sermons, they represented the burden of sin or the inevitability of divine justice. Better to have a millstone hung around one's neck, preachers intoned, quoting the Gospels, than to cause the innocent to stumble. In some areas, the church banned mills from operating on feast days, but enforcement was inconsistent, especially during harvest or famine. Flour, after all, was as necessary as prayer. Though millers were usually men, mill labor involved entire families. Wives often kept the books or managed disputes with customers. Sons helped clean the race, turn gear mechanisms, or assist with stone dressing. In some communities, widows of millers continued to operate mills independently, unusual autonomy for women in rural life. They became legal custodians of the site until remarriage or retirement. Children swept the floors, managed chickens, and helped feed the donkeys or oxen that hauled grain carts. Everyone in the household inhaled flour dust, heard the endless groaning of the wheel, and understood the delicate balance between grain, time, and trust. This hidden labor sustained the mill and kept the family on its precarious perch above peasant life. During periods of famine, war, or tax increase, resentment toward millers often boiled over. Mills were burned, stones shattered, and toll records destroyed. In the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, rebellious groups specifically targeted grain stores and mills, symbols of manorial power and economic exploitation. These moments of violence were rare but telling. For the poor, the miller was not just a neighbor, he was the man who turned necessity into advantage. A grinding wheel could feed a village, or grind it further into submission. As the steward tallies the multure and the miller turns back to his dusty stones, you can feel the weight in the air not just of flour, but of unspoken power. The grindstone turns for all but not equally, and so we must ask, when the wheel of life is owned by another, is the rhythm still yours? It is late afternoon now. The wheel turns more slowly than before. A few last villagers bring their sacks of grain, hopping to make it before the water level drops too low. The miller tightens a belt, taps the chute with the back of his hand, and watches the last kernels fall between the stones. For centuries, this cycle has remained unchanged. The steady rhythm of the wheel, the grinding stones, the trade of grain for flour. But beyond the village, change is stirring. And soon, the very foundation of the miller's world will begin to shift. By the 15th century, the rigid structures of feudalism were beginning to erode. Serfdom, while still present, was weakening. As peasants gained more freedom of movement and labor shifted toward market economies, manorial monopolies, including the obligation to use the lord's mill, were increasingly challenged. Tenants began to question their obligations. Some fled to towns where they could grind grain freely. Others bartered with private millers outside the estate's control. Legal cases arose in manorial courts over who truly owned the right to grind and whether such rights were just. The Statute of Laborers in post-plague England and similar reforms in France and the Holy Roman Empire began to shift power away from landed lords and toward laborers and tradespeople. The village miller found himself caught in the middle. His once secure position, guaranteed by legal obligation, was slowly being chipped away by economic change. Another change came not by law, but by technology. Around the 12th century in northern Europe, windmills began to appear. Unlike water mills, they did not require a flowing stream. They could be built on hilltops or open fields. They spread widely in the Low Countries, Germany, and eventually England. Windmills were more complex mechanically, with rotating caps and adjustable sails, but they offered independence. A farmer with enough land and resources could build one himself, freeing him from the manorial mill. For the traditional miller, this was both competition and disruption. The wheel by the river was no longer the only way to grind. The rhythm of the stream was no longer the pulse of village life. As cities grew, so did demand for centralized, high-volume milling. Large towns began to invest in urban mills powered by rivers, wind, or even animals walking in circles. These merchant mills served bakeries, breweries, and exporters. They operated at scales unthinkable for the local miller. Some had multiple pairs of stones, iron-reinforced gears, and warehouses for storing grain. As trade routes opened and commercial grain markets flourished, the humble village mill lost its centrality. It didn't vanish, but it became one piece in a broader, more impersonal system. Where once the miller knew every face that passed through his door, now flour arrived in barrels, sold wholesale by weight, not by name. Though its economic power declined, the millstone remained a powerful symbol of burden, of labor, of slow and steady endurance. In folklore, the mill still haunted songs and proverbs. To carry a millstone around one's neck meant a burden too heavy to bear. Dreams of millstones were said to foretell conflict or opportunity, depending on whether the stones were turning or still. In paintings from the Renaissance onward, mills were often romanticized, placed among pastoral fields, symbols of continuity in a changing world. Few artists depicted the dust, the cracked hands, or the tension over multure, but they captured the image that endured, the grinding stone as the heart of old Europe. Into the 18th and 19th centuries, rural mills continued to operate, but many were now privately owned, operating as small businesses rather than feudal obligations. Millers became tradesmen, not functionaries. In some regions, especially in Eastern Europe and the rural Alps, traditional mills survived into the 20th century. Elderly millers passed down stone dressing techniques by word of mouth. Some mills were even rebuilt after wartime destruction, not for commerce but for memory. In these places, the millstone became a relic of resilience, its weight a reminder of continuity in the face of modernization. Today, many historical mills survive as open-air museums. Visitors can walk inside the cool, dark rooms, hear the creaking gears, and watch costumed millers pour grain into the hoppers. Children gape as flour billows into bins, and docents explain how the wheel outside still turns with the river's gentle push. Some stones, cracked from centuries of work, are displayed like fossils. Others are buried in the earth, their grooves worn smooth, their work complete. The miller is gone, but the story remains in every loaf of bread, every bag of flour, and every quiet stream that once turned a wheel. The miller steps back and wipes his hands. The stone slow to a stop, the last of the day's flour settled in the bin. He listens for the water outside. It still flows as it always has, but he knows that one day it may flow past an empty mill. So consider, if history is built on what we eat and how we survive, then how many forgotten lives once turned the great, grinding wheels of civilization? It is morning in Thebes, during the 19th dynasty of Egypt around 1250 BCE. The air is dry and already warm, thick with the scent of reed fires and river silt. Inside a small but orderly mud-brick building near the Temple of Karnak, a man sharpens a reed pen. He dips it into a well of carbon ink, breathes carefully, and begins writing. The scribe sits cross-legged on a woven mat, a roll of papyrus stretched across his lap. He is surrounded by shelves of carefully tied scrolls, wooden chests of records, and clay jars filled with ink and pigment. His day will be long, repetitive, and precise, but it is also sacred. For in a world without printing presses, typewriters, or computers, The scribe is the machine. He is the archive, the bureaucracy, the interface between the temple, the crown, and the commoner. And today, like every day, the records must be copied, tallied, sealed, and preserved for the gods and for the king. To be a scribe in ancient Egypt was not merely to know how to write. It was to belong to the administrative class, educated, respected, and essential. Scribes were responsible for managing temple accounts, recording agricultural yields, copying religious texts, tracking tax collection, and issuing legal documents. Nothing official happened without a written record, and few could read or write. Literacy was a specialized skill, held mostly by men trained from youth in scribal schools. The House of Life, per Ankh, a term used for temple libraries and scribal workshops, was where this work happened. It was not open to the public. It held both secular and sacred texts, medical manuals, mythological scrolls, tax registers, hymnals, and royal decrees. Here, the scribe did his work not in haste or vanity, but in careful devotion to continuity. To write was to preserve, to authorize, to give form to power. The scribe's writing kit was simple, elegant, and remarkably durable. It typically included a palette, usually made of wood or ivory, with slots for black and red ink. Reed pens, calami, sharpened to a chisel point dipped into ink to write. Papyrus scrolls, made from the inner pith of the papyrus plant, dried and pressed into thin sheets. A water container, used to adjust ink consistency and clean pens. Wax tablets or ostraca, used for quick notes or drafts, especially on pottery shards or limestone flakes. Black ink was used for regular text. Red ink, more precious, was reserved for headings, names of gods, and important phrases. Writing was done right to left, in horizontal lines or sometimes vertical columns. Each stroke mattered. One slip of the pen could change a word, shift a meaning, or invalidate an official record. The scribe's day was long and monotonous to outsiders. He arrived early, sometimes before the temple priests. He received orders from overseers, then began transcribing. Inventories of grain delivered to the temple. Distribution logs of linen or oil for rituals. Tax receipts from farmers and fishermen. Census lists, property transfers, or legal agreements. For each, the format had to be precise. Names, titles, measurements, and dates were recorded using both hieratic script, a cursive form of hieroglyphs, and numerical signs. Mistakes were not easily corrected. Often, the entire document had to be redone. Sometimes, two scribes worked together. One read aloud from an original scroll while the other copied it. At other times, they checked each other's work, speaking in whispers so as not to disrupt the solemn quiet of the archive. The scribe rarely looked up. His world was measured in lines, symbols, and dust. Despite the quiet nature of the job, scribes held significant status in Egyptian society. They were exempt from manual labor and often from military service. They dressed neatly, walked freely through temple courtyards, and interacted directly with priests, officials, and even royal envoys. Their education was long beginning in childhood, often through temple schools or family apprenticeships. Boys were taught not only to read and write, but to calculate, memorize official phrases, and internalize the language of order. A good scribe could rise in rank. Some became high officials, royal secretaries, or temple administrators. A few became viziers, overseeing entire regions on behalf of the pharaoh. And yet, even at the lowest level, the scribe wielded quiet authority. A man with no title and no land could not get a grain receipt or marriage contract without a scribe. Despite the prestige, the work took a toll. Sitting hunched for hours each day caused joint pain. The fingers stiffened, the eyes strained. Ink-stained hands cracked in the dry air. Scrolls had to be stored carefully, tied with string and marked with clay seals. Misfiling a scroll could bring punishment. Losing one was worse. Scribes lived in a world of precision, permanence, and pressure. Their mistakes did not vanish with the day; they were preserved for generations. To write a bad document was not just poor work, it was a break in the thread that connected the people to their gods, their land, and their king. As the sun climbs and the heat intensifies, the scribe finishes one scroll and reaches for the next. There is no applause, no thanks, only another record to copy. But somewhere, centuries later, archaeologists will unearth his work. And you may wonder, how many great civilizations survive not by war or conquest, but because someone, somewhere, took the time to write things down? The sun is now high over Thebes, casting sharp light through slatted windows and warming the clay walls of the House of Life. Inside, the scribe squints slightly, refilling his ink wells. The room remains quiet, only the sound of pens scratching papyrus, and the rustling of scrolls being opened and tied shut again. He stretches his shoulders, then returns to his work. He is copying a legal register, entries of property transfers, dowries, and oaths sworn before temple witnesses. Each transaction must be recorded in full. The names must match the census records. The land must be identified by boundaries. The tamarisk tree to the east, the canal bend to the north. Nothing can be left to assumption. These are not just scribbles on paper. They are legally binding declarations, recognized by the temple, the court, and ultimately the pharaoh. If there is a dispute over land, inheritance, or taxes, these scrolls will be consulted, maybe years later. He writes carefully. In this world, ink is as powerful as the crown. In the House of Records, scribes were responsible for producing a wide variety of documents, both sacred and administrative. Tax records detailing the grain owed and received by each household, often revised seasonally. Census scrolls, tracking individuals' occupations, property ownership, and family relationships. Legal contracts, including sales, loans, marriages, wills, and adoption papers. Temple inventories, documenting items used in rituals. Incense, oils, textiles, sacred vessels. Offering lists, long scrolls detailing what sacrifices should be made to which gods, and on which dates. Calendars and almanacs, used to schedule festivals, state events, and agricultural tasks. Mythological and ritual texts, copies of hymns, funerary prayers, and parts of the Book of the Dead. The overlap between spiritual and secular was constant. The temple was not just a religious institution, it was a bank, a granary, a school, and a government office. The scribe moved between all these functions, his pen authorizing reality. Egypt's central government depended heavily on its scribes. Unlike oral cultures that passed on knowledge by memory or monument, Egypt valued the permanence of the written word. The pharaoh issued decrees, but without scribes to record and disseminate them, those decrees were meaningless. Taxes could not be collected, land could not be measured, and temples could not function without documentation. Even the great state-sponsored building projects, pyramids, temples, roads, began with the scribe. Materials were tracked, laborers were listed, rations were calculated. Scribes recorded it all, scroll by scroll. One surviving scroll, known as the Turin taxation papyrus, lists village names, expected yields, and receipts. Another, the Wilbur papyrus, includes over 1,000 entries of land use and taxation from the reign of Ramesses V. These were not high poetry, but they were the lifeblood of the kingdom. With such centrality came opportunity. Scribes controlled the books. They had access to names, numbers, and dates. A scribe could misreport a harvest, forge a document, or delete a debt. Not all did so, of course, but corruption existed, and it was hard to detect. When famine struck or when temple officials grew greedy, scribes were sometimes implicated in fraud. In one case from a provincial archive, a peasant accused a scribe of altering a deed to favor a relative. The scribe was brought before a temple court and punished not just because of theft, but because he had undermined the integrity of the written word. That was the deeper crime. The scribe wasn't just an administrator, he was a custodian of divine truth. A pen used dishonestly threatened the gods' order as much as it disrupted legal proceedings. Not all scribes were equal. Within the House of Records, there was a strict hierarchy. Junior apprentices began with wax tablets, learning to draw hieratic signs by repetition. Assistants copied simple lists, tallied grain deliveries, and carried scrolls between offices. Certified scribes, after years of training, wrote full records, received assignments, and sat alongside priests during rituals. Overseers of scribes managed archives, resolved disputes, and trained others. At the top were royal scribes, who served directly under temple officials or court administrators. Becoming a high-level scribe could lead to wealth and influence. Some scribes were rewarded with land, official housing, or even family marriages arranged by the temple. But most remained in the middle, respected, modestly paid, and bound to the temple for life. A single legal scroll might take several hours to produce, longer if it included multiple witnesses, seals, or illustrations. Religious texts, such as the Book of the Dead, took weeks or even months to copy by hand. Scribes worked under pressure. Mistakes delayed proceedings. Disputes over interpretation fell back on them. If a papyrus was too brittle or the ink ran thin, the entire scroll might be ruined. And yet there was pride in the work. A well-made scroll was a work of art, a physical embodiment of order, proof that the world was functioning as it should. As the scribe leans back, drying a new scroll before sealing it with clay, he does not smile or boast. He simply moves on to the next task. But the document he just created may outlive dynasties, flood seasons, and pharaohs. And so you might wonder, in an age of pyramids and gods, was the real monument built not in stone but in ink? The sun begins its slow descent over the Nile, casting a golden glow across temple walls and reflecting on the river's surface. In the scribal chamber, the day's work is nearly done. Scrolls are tied with palm fiber twine. Ink pots are sealed. The last notes are checked and cross-referenced. The scribe rises carefully, joints stiff from hours of sitting. He stores the documents inside clay jars, each marked with the proper seal of the House of Life. Then he extinguishes the small lamp on his desk. Outside, the cicadas have begun their twilight chorus. He leaves quietly, his sandals brushing the dry earth, unaware that the records he just copied may survive for thousands of years long after his name has faded from memory. Egyptian scribes worked with the knowledge that their documents might last. Papyrus, though vulnerable to moisture, is remarkably durable in dry climates. In the arid sands of Egypt, scrolls could survive intact for centuries, especially when stored in pottery jars, stone chambers, or hidden tombs. Temple archives were vast. Scrolls were categorized by topic, author, and date. Scribes left margin notes to help future readers find relevant entries. Some archives even had early forms of indexing. Yet despite all precautions, many documents vanished. Fires, floods, theft, neglect, these erased much of what once existed. For every surviving papyrus, countless others were lost. The House of Records, for all its order, lived under the constant threat of impermanence. And still scribes worked. They knew that a scroll once written might someday become a lifeline for a tax collector, a farmer disputing land, or a priest preparing offerings. In their dusty storerooms, time was archived. To the ancient Egyptians, writing was not just a tool, it was a divine force. The god Thoth, depicted with the head of an ibis, was the patron of scribes. He was said to have invented writing, measured time, and recorded the deeds of both gods and men. Scribes often began their work with short invocations to Thoth or inscribed protective formulas on the margins of important scrolls. Some carried amulets shaped like reed pens or scribal palettes. In royal tombs, images of scribes appear alongside depictions of judges and priests, proof that writing, law, and ritual were part of the same sacred continuum. Even in death, scribes carried their tools. Many were buried with ink palettes, pens, and tiny scrolls ready, it was believed, to record their deeds before the gods in the afterlife. The true power of the scribe was not in recording royal decrees or temple inventories, but in documenting the everyday lives of ordinary people. A list of linen deliveries reveals how widows were clothed after funerals. A tax register shows how floods shifted village economies. A marriage contract outlines expectations, promises, and property divisions that echo human concerns across millennia. In one letter from a worker in the village of Deir el-Medina, a man complains about late rations and broken tools. In another, a farmer begs for a tax reduction after a poor harvest. These voices, preserved by scribes, are rare windows into the lives of those who left no monuments. Without scribes, these people would be silent to history. But writing, for all its power, could not prevent decline. As Egypt faced invasions, internal divisions, and shifting power, scribal authority waned. Under Greek and later Roman rule, Egyptian script was slowly replaced by Greek and Latin. The Demotic script gave way to Coptic, and temples fell out of state control. With them, the scribes lost their roles as record keepers and advisors. Some adapted, others vanished. By the time of the Arab conquest in the 7th century CE, few could still read hieroglyphs, and the once thriving house of life had gone dark. Only scattered scrolls, buried jars, and inscriptions carved into temple stone remained. In the 19th and 20th centuries, archaeologists uncovered caches of papyri in desert caves, tombs, and abandoned archives. Some were religious texts, others were shopping lists, tax complaints, or love letters. Each one had passed through a scribe's hand read, copied, stored. Suddenly, the quiet scribes of ancient Egypt returned. Their handwriting was studied. Their marginal notes were debated. Modern historians pored over every ink stroke, trying to understand not just what was written, but why, how, and by whom. One scroll, now in the British Museum, includes a note in faded red ink. This was copied faithfully from the original. May Thoth judge me true. The scribe is unnamed, but his concern for accuracy echoes across the centuries. The scribe's work was often unseen, uncelebrated. Yet every institution, temple, palace, market, courtroom depended on him. He was the accountant, the registrar, the notary, the historian. He worked in ink and silence. And while kings built pyramids and priests invoked gods, the scribe wrote it all down. Without him, there would be no record of what was built, believed, promised, or forgotten. As night falls over Thebes, the scribe's sealed scrolls rest in the cool darkness of the archive. He walks home beneath a sky the same shade of blue seen by pharaohs and farmers alike. He is tired, but satisfied. He does not know that, one day, someone in a far-off age will read his work under electric light, but maybe he doesn't need to. Because you might wonder, in a world obsessed with glory, was it the man who simply recorded what happened faithfully, quietly, who left the longest shadow? The year is roughly 480 BCE, and you are standing beside a road that stretches further than your eyes can follow. It's a packed earth track bordered by carefully placed stones and flanked by shaded rest stations every few leagues. Dust floats in the hot air. Far off in the distance, a dark smudge moves swiftly closer. It is a horseman cloaked in wool, satchel bouncing against his side, eyes narrowed with determination. As he gallops past, you glimpse the emblem of the Angarium, the royal courier system of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. This man does not ride for pleasure or trade. He rides for the King of Kings. His message is written in cuneiform or Aramaic, sealed in a leather pouch. He cannot delay. He is one of hundreds, possibly thousands of riders who made up one of the most advanced communication networks of the ancient world. This is the Royal Road, and it binds together one of the largest empires history had yet seen. The Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great expanded rapidly in the 6th century BCE, eventually stretching from the Aegean Sea to the Indus Valley. With territory came complexity: dozens of satrapies, provinces, countless languages and cultures, military campaigns, tribute routes, and seasonal migration patterns. To manage such a realm, the empire needed speed and consistency. Orders from Persepolis or Susa had to reach Sardis in weeks, not months. Governors had to send updates. Armies required provisioning. Rebellions needed quelling before they grew. The solution was visionary. Construct a system of roads with pre-built stations, fresh mounts, and authorized riders trained for endurance and discretion. At its peak, the Royal Road stretched over 1,500 miles, from Sardis in western Anatolia to Susa near the Persian Gulf. But that was just one of many arterial routes. A vast web of paths and branches connected the farthest corners of the empire. The Angarium was the official courier service of the empire, a state-sponsored relay of trusted riders. Their mission: carry sealed messages between imperial capitals, satrapal headquarters, and strategic outposts. How it worked: riders traveled in relays, not continuously. Stations were placed roughly every 15-20 miles, with food, shelter, and fresh horses. A message could travel over 250 miles in a single day, vastly outpacing private travelers. Couriers carried a royal pass, a sealed document proving their authority to demand resources along the road. The Greek historian Herodotus, who traveled through the Persian Empire, marveled at the system. Nothing mortal travels faster than these Persian messengers. Neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor darkness of night prevents these couriers from completing their appointed course. Sound familiar? That's the spiritual ancestor of the modern postal creed. Along the Royal Road, the Persians built more than just waypoints. Many stations were fortified, doubling as watchposts or garrisons. These were not only used by couriers, they housed troops, tax officials, engineers, and record keepers. The roads themselves were built with graded surfaces to handle carts and horses. Bridges were constructed over rivers, and ferries operated at wide crossings. Inns and wells were placed at key points, and some roads even had measured markers, a rarity in the ancient world. It wasn't only the king who benefited. Merchants, pilgrims, and craftsmen all used the roads, but only the Angarium had legal right of way. Everyone else moved aside. To be a royal courier was no ordinary profession. These riders were expected to endure hardship without question. They faced harsh terrain: mountains, deserts, floodplains; language barriers at remote outposts; bandits or rebellious locals; extreme weather: Persian summers and Anatolian winters. And yet they were trained to ride day and night, stopping only to exchange mounts. Each courier memorized large portions of terrain. The messages they carried were sealed and coded, and tampering with one was a capital crime. It was said that the courier rode not for his own life, but for the word of the king, and the word of the king was law. Messages were written in various languages depending on the province: Old Persian, Elamite, Akkadian, or the empire's diplomatic language, Imperial Aramaic. Important documents were written on leather scrolls or strips, clay tablets in waterproof containers, wooden boards covered in wax and sealed with cord. They were stamped with the seal of the sender, often a satrap, general, or priest, and marked with the imperial order of urgency. Every station maintained records: arrival times, transfer logs, and inventory of supplies. It was bureaucracy in motion, and its efficiency astonished even the empire's enemies. As the rider disappears into the distance, you are left with the hush of the road and the whisper of wind through reeds. Somewhere, far ahead, another courier waits with a fresh horse. Somewhere behind, a royal order has already traveled 200 miles today. And so you wonder, what kind of empire builds its power not just on conquest but on a road of silence, speed, and invisible ink? The wax seal is pressed firmly into warm cord. The letter has been folded, bound, and stamped with the emblem of the satrap of Lydia. The writer bows, secures the message in a pouch, mounts a waiting horse, and sets off at once toward the east. He will not see the entire journey. He's merely the first link in a chain, one of many relays tasked with carrying this message 1,500 miles to Susa. The orders concern taxation, troop movements, and a new road levy. Time is of the essence. As he rides, he is not just crossing terrain, he is part of a living information system, built and maintained for the sole purpose of keeping the empire stitched together. The Achaemenid Empire, particularly under Darius I, 522–486 BCE, was one of the most bureaucratically advanced civilizations in the ancient world. Darius divided the empire into satrapies, each governed semi-independently but held accountable to the central court. These provinces were obligated to send annual tributes in goods, animals, or coin, military support, including levies for campaigns, reports on population, land use, and local politics. This enormous flow of data could only function with an equally enormous communication network, and that network was the Angarium on the royal road. Each satrapy had its own administrators, but they spoke to the king through the road. Decisions made in Persepolis reached Sardis in under 2 weeks. Messages from Egypt arrived by ship, then took the road to Susa within days. This efficiency wasn't optional, it was essential to survival. One of the most fascinating aspects of the Persian road system was its integration with royal intelligence operations. The empire relied on a network known to Greek historians as the king's eyes and ears, official inspectors who traveled in secret or under diplomatic cover, reporting back on satraps, generals, and local officials. These inspectors used the same road system and courier services, but their reports bypassed provincial administration and went directly to the court. The system ensured loyalty, transparency, and accountability. A satrap might appear obedient in his province, but if a courier delivered word of misconduct to Persepolis, the punishment could be swift and brutal. Some satraps were arrested, replaced, or even executed on orders relayed across the royal road. Thus, the road was not merely for mail, it was for surveillance. A fast-moving report could end a man's career before his own letter of defense arrived. To maintain this system, each rest station, called a chaparkhane in later Persian, followed a strict routine. Fresh horses were kept ready at all times. A logbook recorded arrivals and departures. Inns and stables were maintained with supplies of grain, water, and fodder. Scribes or overseers confirmed the seals on messages. These stations were operated by royal staff, not locals, to ensure loyalty. Most were located near wells, rivers, or crossroads. Guards were sometimes stationed to protect cargo, especially near volatile borders. The entire road system was also patrolled by military detachments, tasked with maintaining order, repairing bridges, and clearing debris after storms. The couriers themselves did not eat elaborate meals or rest long. Their priority was movement, not comfort. As one rider arrived, another was already saddled and waiting. The message rarely stopped moving. Most royal dispatches were not long, flowery letters. They were concise, official, and formulaic, designed for clarity. A typical courier load might include military directives: move 300 archers to the southern gate of Ecbatana. Tax orders: levy 100 talents of silver from Caria by midsummer. Legal appeals: from citizens, nobles, or priests seeking intervention from the king. Trade permissions: allowing caravans to move between satrapies. Diplomatic communications, from or to foreign kings, carried with elaborate seals. Messages were categorized by urgency. The fastest were marked with the king's personal seal and could commandeer additional resources en route. Others, of lower priority, followed the standard pace. The Angarium also occasionally carried gifts, scrolls, and ceremonial items, though with risk, as robbers or enemy forces sometimes targeted couriers known to carry valuables. The royal road was not just an administrative lifeline, it was a cultural corridor. Travelers, though slower and less privileged than the Angarium, used the same route. Along the road, one could encounter Greek merchants from the Aegean, Phoenician scribes traveling to Babylon, Egyptian priests en route to temple festivals, Zoroastrian fire carriers delivering sacred flames to new altars. These interactions made the road a place of blended customs. A rest station might serve Persian food, but its stable hand could be Lydian, its overseer Median, and its guardsmen Egyptian conscripts. Languages mingled, trade passed hands. Ideas traveled not just in scrolls but in stories shared beside campfires. During periods of war or rebellion, such as the Ionian Revolt, 499–493 BCE, or the campaigns of Xerxes, the road system became a battlefield. Messages were delayed, couriers disappeared, bridges were burned. Governors sent urgent pleas for reinforcements, and the speed of the Angarium determined the outcome. One intercepted message could change the course of a siege. One delay could mean the loss of a city. And still the roads were repaired, horses replaced, and riders dispatched. For every crisis there was a courier somewhere, galloping through dust, ensuring the empire held its shape. As a tired courier hands off a sealed pouch to the next rider under a moonlit sky, neither speaks. They don't need to. The message must move. The empire depends on it. And you might wonder, in a world of swords and monuments, was the real strength of Persia not in how it conquered, but in how it communicated? The surface is cracked. Weeds push through the stone lining. The inn has collapsed into dust. A wooden post once used to tether fresh horses now leans at an awkward angle, forgotten. But the road remains, a dry scar etched across the land. It is the 4th century BCE. The Persian Empire is crumbling, and the once proud royal road, the artery of Achaemenid power, is beginning to fade. But like all great systems, its influence lingers far beyond its years. As Darius III faced the rising power of Alexander the Great, the empire's infrastructure, once its greatest strength, was strained to breaking. Alexander's army moved along the same roads that once carried Persian royal orders. The irony was not lost on observers. A Macedonian conqueror using Persian roads to bring down the Persian state. By the 330s BCE, internal revolts, satrapal betrayals, and collapsed communication lines plagued the empire. Messages that once took days now took weeks or never arrived at all. The Angarium, dependent on central authority and generous funding, began to falter. Stations were abandoned, horses starved, scribes vanished. The road was still there, but the system behind it, the engine of coordination, was gone. Alexander did not destroy the royal road. He repurposed it. His conquests moved swiftly because the infrastructure was already in place. He stationed garrisons at key relay points and rebranded outposts with Macedonian names. Greek and Aramaic became co-official languages of administration. But even with his genius for logistics, Alexander's empire was short-lived. After his death, his generals, known as the Diadochi, splintered the territories. The road no longer linked a unified realm. It became a shared relic, stretched across rival kingdoms. The Seleucids maintained parts of it in Mesopotamia. The Ptolemies controlled segments in Egypt. But no one, not even Rome, would replicate the sheer imperial coordination of the Persian postal system for centuries. As Persia declined, the concept of road as empire began to shift. In earlier times, the royal road was the nervous system of a state, a literal extension of the king's will. Now, it became more economic than imperial. Merchants still used the roads, but their primary concern was profit, not governance. Cities along the road became trade hubs, temples of faded glory or ruins. The great post stations turned into inns, markets, or military outposts for successor states. In time, dust covered the grooves carved by countless hooves. The road, once royal, became anonymous. The Persian postal system was not forgotten. Later empires copied it, consciously or otherwise. The Roman cursus publicus, its state courier system, mirrored the Angarium. Relay stations with fresh horses. Official documents sealed and guarded. Roads patrolled and maintained by state agents. In Byzantium, a similar system endured for centuries, though with fewer resources. Even in the Islamic caliphates, the concept of barid, a courier and intelligence network, echoes the Persian model. Each time the idea was the same: control required communication. Though the names changed, Angarium, cursus publicus, barid, the principle remained. The road is the empire, and the message is its lifeblood. Even the word survived. In modern Persian, the word for post office is still derived from barid. In Greek and Latin chronicles, references to the swiftness of Persian couriers became a literary motif, faster than the Persian horse. The notion of unstoppable mail delivery, a concept echoed today in postal slogans, can be traced back to Herodotus's description of the Angarium. Neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor gloom of night. These words, carved on the James Farley Post Office in New York, owe a debt to riders galloping across Anatolia nearly 2,500 years ago. And still, most people have never heard of them. Archaeologists have traced segments of the Royal Road in modern-day Turkey, Iraq, and Iran. Near Gordian, traces of a stone-paved section survive, along with remnants of a station complex with stables and cisterns. In Susa, inscriptions reference royal couriers and their provisions. Few physical relics remain. Roads were repaved, stations dismantled, and timber structures long vanished. But the road lines align eerily with modern highways and train routes, proving that ancient geography still shapes present-day infrastructure. The empires may change, but the land remembers. In a digital age, it's easy to forget that civilizations once relied on men, horses, and dirt paths to hold themselves together. But the lessons endure. Governance requires reach. Power is only real if it can be communicated. The most effective control is often quiet, repetitive, and boring: a message sealed, carried, and passed along without fanfare. The Persian royal road wasn't glorious. It wasn't even particularly beautiful. But it worked. And that work, silent, dusty, and relentless, helped sustain one of the greatest empires the world has known. As the wind whistles across an ancient roadbed somewhere in western Iran, you might bend to touch the stones flattened by centuries of hoof and foot. There's no plaque, no monument. But if you listen closely, you might still hear hoofbeats in the distance. And perhaps you'll ask, in the end, was it not the sword or the gold, but the quiet courier who made empire possible? It is morning and the Grand Canal is waking. Gondoliers shout over the slap of oars, sails groan under tension. Crates of olives, saffron, wax, and wool are hoisted onto narrow stone docks with practiced rhythm. The Adriatic breeze carries the scent of salt, spice, and smoke. But you are not in the ship. You are in the small, dim office overlooking the Port the Dogana de Mar, the customs house of the Venetian Republic. You are a scrivano di Dogana, a customs clerk, and before you lies the world, not in the form of ships or soldiers, but in ledgers, lists, and ink. Your tools: a goose feather quill, oak gall ink, a string-bound folio, and the authority of La Serenissima, the most serene Republic of Venice. Your duty: to account for everything. The Republic of Venice in the late 15th century was not a large empire by land but by trade. It was a giant. Its influence reached from the Po Valley to Crete, from the Dalmatian coast to the Levant. And to manage that web of commerce, Venice developed one of the most sophisticated bureaucratic systems in the pre-modern world. At the heart of it was you, the customs clerk, neither noble nor particularly wealthy but vital. You track the imports and exports, monitor tax assessments, verify shipping manifests, inspect cargo against declared weight and value. Everything, whether a cask of Cypriot wine or a roll of Florentine silk, must pass through your pen. And that pen must never lie. The system is precise. Goods are documented in triplicate. One copy for the state records at the Doge's chancery. One for the merchant with official countersign. One stored locally at the port's office. You write in a formal mercantile script, clear but compact, using standard abbreviations passed down through generations of clerks. Each line includes ship name and origin, master, captain, and owner, contents of cargo by item, weight, and declared value, taxes assessed. You do not embellish, you do not speculate, you simply record. Mistakes, even minor ones, are punished, not with lashes but with dismissal, or worse, being summoned before the Council of Ten, the powerful and secretive magistrates of Venice's internal security. A misplaced tally could suggest smuggling, and smuggling is treason. So you learn to live by numbers. Your day is marked not by sun or bells but by the rhythm of ships. You arrive at dawn, unlocking the heavy wooden shutters, opening your folio to the first page. The dust is soft and gray on your desk. Pigeons strut on the windowsill. The first ship docks by mid-morning. La Stella di Zara from Dalmatia. You verify the manifest: timber, dried figs, salt. You weigh the casks on stone scales. The dock inspector nods. You note the agreed tax. The merchant frowns, he always does. By midday you've recorded 4 more. One from Corfu, with citrus and oil. Another from Constantinople, bearing eastern spices and fine cotton. Lunch is bread and hard cheese in the corner of the office. You eat with your ink-stained hands because there is no time to wash. Behind you, a junior clerk sharpens quills. The day is only half over. From the outside, you are a man with a desk, but through your records passes the commerce of an empire. You see pepper from India, worth its weight in silver. Glass beads blown in Murano, destined for African markets. Books from Flanders, bound in calfskin. Sugar soap skins, candied orange peel. Silk from Syria, saffron from Spain, tallow candles from Provence, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan. You may never see these places, but you know their names. You've copied them 1,000 times. And through these transactions, you've come to understand a truth. Empires are not built on armies alone, but on accurate bookkeeping. The clerk's life is dull, but not without temptation. Merchants, especially foreigners, sometimes offer a courtesy payment. A few ducats here or there to underreport the weight of a barrel. A smaller tax assessed on luxury cloth. A blind eye turned to a hidden crate. But Venice does not tolerate corruption lightly. The Avogadori di Comune, the state's financial prosecutors, investigate even whispers of malfeasance. One clerk, Antonio of San Luca, was discovered to have underrecorded saffron shipments. He disappeared. Some say he drowned. Others say he now copies texts in a monastery near Verona. Either way, he no longer works the dock office. So you remain diligent. You copy every figure. You double-check. You write slowly, carefully, legibly, because your integrity is your profession. You are not well liked. Merchants see you as an obstruction, an obstacle between their cargo and profit. They speak in different dialects, bargain in half sentences, and scowl at taxes. You in turn see them as greedy, evasive, and impatient. Still, you depend on each other. They need your countersignature to trade legally. You need their goods to meet your quotas and maintain the rhythm of your ledger. Sometimes you talk briefly. A merchant from Rhodes tells you of rough seas and pirates near Naxos. Another from Ancona complains of customs rates that doubled since last winter. A widow trading sea salt thanks you for helping her spell her husband's name correctly on the manifest. But mostly you write, and the merchant waits, tapping his fingers. And yet, not everything that enters Venice is recorded. There are informal networks, unlicensed boats that dock in minor canals, goods that change hands in back alleys before dawn. You hear whispers of rare texts smuggled from Cairo, of silks declared as wool to avoid higher taxes, of deals made between noble families and Greek shipowners, hidden behind false documentation. You report what you must, but you know better than to interfere. Because Venice is a republic, but it is also a web of private arrangements, and the customs clerk is not paid to investigate, only to record. And to record precisely. As the sun lowers over the lagoon and the Dagana is locked for the night, you look at your folio. 17 ships recorded, 219 items logged, 14 tax assessments balanced. A good day, a quiet day. You extinguish your lamp, roll your stiff fingers, and close the shutters. And you wonder, in a city built on water, how many lives float just beneath the surface of the ink. The morning fog curls over the Grand Canal like ribboned cloth, obscuring the tops of masts and the spires beyond. As you unlock your office door at the Dagana de Mar, something is wrong. Your folio from yesterday, sealed, logged, and stored in the iron-bound cabinet, is missing. You freeze. It is not just a notebook. It is the official record of 17 vessels, their goods, taxes, weights. Without it, the ledger at the State Archive cannot be reconciled. Revenues cannot be counted. Discrepancies will raise suspicions. In Venice, paper is power, and power when disturbed draws attention. You have two choices: report the loss and face suspicion yourself, or quietly retrace your steps and find out who might benefit from a vanished record. You choose the latter. To solve a problem in Venice, one must follow the path of information, and information in your world flows in ink. Here is how a day's transactions usually travel. You record entries in your personal pre-folio, an unbound log used for immediate entries. At midday, you transfer summaries to the official folio, signed and counterstamped by the senior clerk. At end of day, the folio is closed, wrapped in oilcloth and locked in the Dagana cabinet. Once a week, a messenger delivers the sealed folios to the Archivio di Stato near the Doge's palace. But yesterday there was no delivery, and now the folio has vanished between point 3 and 4. You suspect someone wanted the record to disappear before it ever reached the archives. The question is, why? Over the past months, you have noticed subtle changes. Certain ships dock with increasing regularity. Declared goods do not match what's observed, and customs taxes are suspiciously underassessed by junior clerks. One name appears repeatedly: Casa di Girolamo Lorden, a merchant syndicate with branches in Corfu, Thessaloniki, and Alexandria. A noble house in name, but in practice, a private cartel. You remember their last ship, Il Leone d'Orient, declared only dried apricots and wine, but the crates bore faint impressions of silk bolts and glass lampwork. You questioned it, but were told the senior clerk approved it. Now that entry is part of the missing folio. A simple omission, or a deliberate effort to erase evidence. Venice prides itself on transparency, but beneath the surface, it thrives on controlled opacity. Its institutions are elaborate, but its power flows through networks of silent favor. There are the Council of 10, Venice's intelligence body, feared for its secret investigations and brutal efficiency. The Signoria, the executive corps tasked with balancing merchant and patrician interests. Guild alliances, particularly the Art dei Mercanti, which monitors legal trade and frowns upon interference from nosy clerks. You are technically under their watch, but your salary is paid by the state. If your investigation uncovers illicit patterns, it might implicate people far above your rank, people with names etched on palazzi or connections to magistrates. And yet you proceed. Not because you're brave, but because if you don't, you'll be the one blamed. You cannot interrogate, you cannot arrest, but you have the two things every bureaucrat fears. Time and access to records. You begin by cross-referencing older folios, dozens of them, in backrooms lit by flickering candles. You copy manifest entries into a private notebook, weights, names, cargo descriptions, tax values. And patterns emerge. Girolamo Loredan's ships are always slightly underdeclared. The same junior clerk signs each folio. The weight discrepancies always by 2 stone, never more are precisely consistent, suggesting method, not error. Then another discovery, an anonymous note tucked inside a folio from 2 weeks prior. It reads only, "Follow the ink, the numbers do not lie." You are not alone in noticing. You confront Pietro, the youngest among your colleagues, nervous, thin, ambitious. Over a midday meal, you speak obliquely. You ever notice how fast the Leone Dorient moves through the weighing docks? He hesitates. They pay well, everything in order. You press, even when the crates don't match the manifests. He looks away. You should be careful what you say, you have no proof. But the tremor in his voice is all the confirmation you need. He knows, and he's either complicit or afraid of someone who is. You begin rebuilding the missing folio, entry by entry, from memory and duplicate slips merchants sometimes keep for their own ledgers. The task is slow. Each page is recreated by hand. Eventually, you have a near-complete reconstruction enough to show that the Loredan shipment was underassessed by nearly 200 ducats, a fortune in spice taxes. You seal the reconstructed folio, mark it duplicate, and send it directly to the Archivio di Stato, bypassing your own office. If nothing happens in a week, you'll know the corruption runs deeper. If something does happen, you're not sure which is worse. 3 days later, a man in black robes arrives at the Dogana. No introduction, no name. He speaks only once. Your folio has been received. It will be considered. And he leaves. The next day, Pietro is gone. No word, no resignation. His desk is cleared before sunrise. The senior clerk says only, "Family matter." The day resumes, ships arrive, manifests are copied, weights are checked. But now, every merchant waits a little longer at your window. Your ink dries a little slower. And somewhere in the city, someone knows that you followed the paper trail. As you close your folio for the evening, now double-locked, you look down at your hands. They are ink-stained, steady, honest. And you wonder, in a city of water and masks, is the clearest truth found not in speech but in numbers? The Dogana de Mar has not changed. The shutters still creak. The fog still wraps around the Grand Canal like a blanket. The barges still arrive, full of dates, tallow, and wax. But you have changed. It is now the year 1501, and you are no longer the youngest customs clerk. You are the oldest. Your hair is thinner, your hands slower, but your ledger is precise, your pen still steady. You now sit at the end desk near the window, the one that overlooks the statue of Fortune, holding her golden orb at the customs house roof. And every day you still write. There is no glory in your work. You will not be remembered. You did not write sonnets, paint saints, or commission palazzi. Your name will not be inscribed in stone. But every ship that passed through Venice in the last 2 decades, Every crate of salt, every barrel of wine, every bolt of silk, you recorded it. You helped fund wars, palaces, roads, and statecraft. You documented the wealth that flowed through the Republic like blood through veins. And you learned a truth known only to those who record, but never speak. What is written shapes what is remembered. Even if your name is forgotten, your numbers remain. While other European cities measure power in castles or battalions, Venice measures it in paper. By the year 1500, the Venetian state produces more written material than any other polity in Europe. Archives swell with customs ledgers, merchant licenses, diplomatic reports, naval logs, guild bylaws, secret council decrees. Each document passes through the hands of people like you, notaries, clerks, scribes who operate quietly, endlessly, and invisibly. This paper empire allows Venice to anticipate shortages, track tax evasion, dissuade conspiracy, and enforce loyalty, all without raising a sword. In your later years, something remarkable happens. The printing press arrives. At first, it is used for Bibles, Psalms, and Greek treatises. But soon, merchants request printed blank ledgers with headings, columns, and tax rate charts. You touch one for the first time. The ink is uniform. The lines are perfect. There are no smudges, no cramped margins. Your reaction is mixed. Awe at the efficiency, sadness at the fatting art of the hand, and worry, will the human element disappear? But the printed ledger cannot weigh a crate. It cannot smell for mold or notice when a declaration is slightly too neat. It cannot raise an eyebrow. So your job remains. For now, despite the changes, the old temptations remain. A shipment of nutmeg declared as lesser spice, a silk roll marked cotton. A merchant offers a generous bribe in gold florins. You do what you always have done. You write what is true. You've seen other clerks leave in disgrace, men younger, richer, cleverer. Some try to retire with quiet fortunes. Others vanish under investigation. A few are exiled to Dalmatia, stripped of pension. You do not envy them. Your wealth is in knowing that every line in your folio is correct. Even if no one else notices, you do. And that is enough. One winter afternoon, while assisting a state archivist with transport, you find it, the original missing folio from years ago. It had been misfiled in a chest marked Corfu salt duties. The wax seal broken, the cover warped by damp, but the entries are legible. You compare it against your reconstruction from memory. It matches, nearly word for word. You smile. Not because it proves anything new, but because it reminds you, you were right. Your hand was sure, your memory precise. In a world of masked men, foggy canals, and whispered bribes, the truth was never grand, it was accurate. In the spring of your 36th year of service, you submit a letter of resignation. It is 3 lines long, polite, formal, without flourish. You receive a pension modest, predictable, enough to rent a room near San Zaccaria and live simply. You are replaced by a boy named Marco, eager and scribbling too fast. You tell him, "Slow your hand, the ink must dry before it speaks." He nods, but he will learn it himself. And so you leave the Dogana one final time. Past the statue of Fortune, past the salt warehouses, past the wooden beams groaning under the weight of empire. And you do not look back. You die quietly with no monument, no portrait, no surviving letters. But centuries later, in the Archivio di Stato di Venezia, a historian opens a folio from 1492 and finds your initials, M.C. Scrivano. They marvel at the detail, the precision, the completeness. They do not know your face, but they rely on your numbers, they trust your tally. Because through your steady hand, we now understand how Venice functioned, what it taxed, who it traded with, how it survived. Empires fall, fortunes vanish, but ledgers endure. And the anonymous clerk, he becomes the foundation on which history rests. As the modern reader glances across faded ink and brittle parchment, a question lingers. Was it the merchants, the nobles, or the silent clerks who truly built Venice? And can a man who never spoke loudly still echo through the centuries? The sky over the Gobi Desert is pale with mourning. The wind rattles against dry stone and battered banners. A caravan waits before a tall earthen gate, flanked by watchtowers, its travelers wrapped in wool and leather, their camels shifting under loads of silk, jade, lapis, and spice. This is Yumenguan, the Jade Gate Pass, the westernmost outpost of the Han Empire. And inside the gate, seated behind a stone desk under a reed canopy, is a man with a brush, a register, and a pile of seals. You are that man, a toll officer of the Han, a lowly civil servant of an ancient empire. And this dusty, forgotten checkpoint perched between nothing and everything is your entire world. Popular imagination treats the Silk Road as a bustling superhighway of trade and treasure. But for most of its history, it was a series of dusty trails, hostile passes, and bureaucratic bottlenecks. At its heart were posts like Yumenguan fortified gate stations where every traveler, every merchant, every animal, and every item of trade had to be recorded, taxed, and interrogated. The glory of the Han dynasty rested not only on the swords of generals like Zhang Kaiyan, but on the slow, deliberate work of paper pushers like you. You are stationed over 1,500 miles from the imperial court in Chang'an, in a region so dry your skin cracks in winter, and your ink dries before your brush hits the page. Your quarters are small, a clay-walled cell beside the registry tower. You sleep on a mat. You wake with the sun. You eat millet porridge and dried fruit, sometimes spiced mutton if the garrison cook is in good humor. Your duties are exact. Record who enters and who leaves the empire. Note what goods they carry. Ensure permits are valid. Collect official tolls, payable in coin, silk bolts, or raw goods. Stamp all entries with the official hand seal. You cannot leave. You cannot refuse a superior. You cannot delay your reports. You are not a soldier. You are not a spy. You are simply the one who writes it all down. Your register is not bound in leather or linen. It is made of bamboo slips, tied together with twine. Each entry requires name of the traveler, place of origin, purpose of travel, inventory of goods, number and species of animals, duration of stay or expected exit. You write with a brush dipped in carbon ink. Your hand must be steady, the characters neat. Mistakes are unacceptable. Sloppiness could imply fraud or worse, collusion with enemies of the state. When finished, you affix the square cinnabar seal of Yumenguan, the final word that transforms ink into law. They come in waves, each with their own dialect, dress, and urgency. Sogdian traders from Samarkand, laden with wine and wool. Bactrian envoys, bringing horses as tribute. Yuezhi exiles seeking peace. Han merchants, wary of wolves and bandits. Buddhist monks, with foreign scrolls and shaven heads. Women and children, sometimes widows of soldiers, sometimes born of the desert itself. Some beg to pass, others bribe, others simply wait, gazing toward the great wall behind them. To each you offer the same thing, a page in the register and a place in the empire's vast memory. Not all is routine. Sometimes trouble comes in silence. A foreign caravan arrives, larger than expected, bearing a noble seal from a kingdom not recognized in the official list. You are told to hold them without explanation. You know what this means. The emperor's court is deliberating whether to acknowledge or ignore their claim to legitimacy. Until then, you stall. And if they grow restless, you rely on the garrison commander. but even he answers to messages from Chang'an that can take weeks to arrive. So you learn the art of polite delay. You ask for clarification. You weigh items again. You say you are reviewing the toll policy. But mostly you wait. This is not a safe post. You are vulnerable to sandstorms, which can bury entire tents, nomadic raids, especially from the Xiongnu, snake bites from vipers that nest in crevices, isolation, which erodes your grip on time. Once a camel train arrived half dead from thirst. Its leader, a one-eyed man from the Fergana Valley, collapsed before signing his manifest. You recorded his name posthumously as unknown and burned incense for his soul. That entry remains in the record. A line without origin, goods, or destination, just one life, lost in bureaucracy. The hand did not tax in abstract figures. It taxed in weight and substance. For every 100 jin of goods, roughly 132 pounds, the toll was one bolt of silk or equivalent copper coin. Foreigners paid higher rates, unless exempted by imperial charter. Sacred items like religious scrolls were not taxed but had to be copied and reviewed by the court. Your own cut, a stipend of food, a meager allowance, and sometimes a silk bolt for exceptional diligence, though you haven't received one in 5 years. Still you record, because without you, the empire would be blind at its edge. One evening, as you review the day's entries, you discover a missing slip. A merchant's name is written, but the list of goods is absent. No weight, no toll, no seal. You don't remember the interaction. Was it skipped, bribed, falsified by a subordinate, or did you just once for a moment forget? You stare at the bamboo for a long time, brush in hand. To fix it now would be forgery, but to leave it is a risk. You mark the line with a double stroke and add a small note in the margin. Pending clarification, merchant departed west. And hope no one notices. As the sun sets over Yumenguan and the fire crackles in your brazier, you close your ledger and gaze westward. Tomorrow new travelers will come, new weights, new names, and you will record them. But tonight you wonder, how many lives have passed your desk, entire histories, loves, kingdoms reduced to a line of characters on a bamboo slip? And will anyone, centuries from now, ever read them? It is early spring at Yumenguan. The wind is sharp, but the air carries a scent of thawed sand and dried camel dung. Your reed canopy clatters overhead as you sip weak tea from a cracked clay bowl. The quiet is broken by a low, persistent rumble. You step beyond the gate and see them, over 50 camels, nearly double the average caravan size. Wagons follow, wooden, heavy laden, flanked by mounted guards in dark silk and scale armor. Their banners bear no merchant mark. Instead, they carry the red square of the imperial treasury. This is not trade, this is imperial logistics. And it will test everything you've learned about quiet survival on the edge of the Han world. The Han Empire, like all agrarian states, fed itself through rice and millet, but supplying distant military outposts, especially across deserts and mountains, required enormous bureaucratic coordination. What you're seeing now is one such effort, a grain caravan bound for Dunhuang, and ultimately for Han garrisons further west. These caravans are rare and deeply significant. They move state-owned grain from central depots. They are exempt from tolls. They are guarded, logged, and observed with suspicion. This one, you soon learn, is carrying surplus grain from the Yellow River Basin, redirected to supply troops fighting renewed Xiongnu incursions. It is your job to record the caravan, verify its charter, and do nothing else. But what if you see something wrong? The leader of the caravan, a middle-aged man with half a mustache and a military gait, presents the Imperial Movement Charter, a long scroll sealed with red wax. You recognize the language. It is legitimate almost. but something tugs at your memory, a missing subclause, an incorrect signature. You ask, where is the subseal from the Dunhuang commissary office? He shrugs, it will be provided there, we came directly from Liangzhu. You nod slowly, it's not illegal, but it's unusual. You log the charter number, list the caravan's inventory, and issue a temporary approval. But you place a small black mark next to the registry line, a secret note to yourself. It's nothing, and it could be everything. You are not a judge, you are not a censor, but you are part of a system that feeds both. All toll clerks are trained to notice irregularities in seals, ink color, wax texture, paper style, signature structure. Over time, you've learned to recognize who wrote which character, to detect the difference between imperial script and a lazy forgery, between a noble's clerk and a garrison captain. This ability makes you dangerous, but only if you choose to speak. Most clerks don't. You have not for 20 years. Yet today you write an extra scroll, marked for the Dunhuang office attention, verification required. It's discreet, bureaucratic, unassuming. But it might shake an empire's supply chain. The caravan departs at dawn, leaving behind dust, spilled grain, and a trail of sandal prints. 3 days later, a courier returns not from Dunhuang, but from Liangzhu, where the caravan originated. He bears a sealed letter addressed to you. Inside, a folded strip of bark paper. Let things pass as they must. The grain matters more than the ink. There is no name, but the seal broken deliberately is from the Office of Supply Allocation. They know what you did. They are telling you to stop, and reminding you that your life, your pension, your position all hang on how obediently you write. Soon after, the garrison commander visits you. He does not sit. You're writing too much, he says. I write what I see. He stares at the bamboo slips stacked beside your register. This is the desert, he says, not the capital. Don't act like you're in Chang'an. Then he leaves. You record the interaction in your private scroll, stored under your sleeping mat. A habit born from years of watching corruption rise and fall like dunes. From that day on, you're watched more closely. Your logs are reviewed more often. A junior clerk is assigned to assist you, but he copies your slips and passes messages too quickly to be doing only clerical work. You understand, you are being tested for loyalty, for silence. But you also know this. If something goes wrong with that grain, if it fails to reach the western garrisons, or if it spoils along the way, someone will look for a scapegoat. And it will not be the generals. It will be the man who marked the ledger. You. Weeks later, a dusty messenger arrives from Dunhuang. There has been a shortfall in the grain count, 8 wagons missing, documented as delivered, but never received. An investigation is underway. You are summoned to provide your copies of the register, the charter, and your additional scroll. And this is where your role becomes both dangerous and essential. Because you did not only write down what you saw, you flagged it, documented inconsistencies, and noted the risk. And because you did that, you are spared. For now, what happened to the missing grain? Theories circulate. Diverted to black markets in the Tarim Basin. Requisitioned by a rogue general. Lost in a desert ambush. Or perhaps it never existed at all. Phantom wagons declared to pad someone's treasury. You will never know, nor are you allowed to ask. But your actions triggered a quiet review of grain logistics. A new rule is passed. All imperial movement charters must carry double seals, verified at both origin and destination. It is never attributed to you. But you know. That night, as the fire dims and you wrap your cloak tighter, you reopen your private scroll. You write. One man cannot stop corruption, but he can name it, and sometimes that is enough. Then you close the scroll, slide it beneath your mat, and sleep with the knowledge that ink silent, slow, easily ignored sometimes echoes louder than command. But will anyone remember the man who noticed the missing seal? It is the winter of 83 BCE. The wind hisses across the stones of Yumenguan like a whisper from centuries past. Snow gathers in dry sheets against the outer wall. The once busy courtyard stands mostly empty, save for a stray goat and a pair of untended grain sacks. The watchtower is crumbling. The once bold cinnabar seal on the front archway has faded to rust red. The road to the west remains, but fewer feet tread upon it now. You sit alone in the gatehouse, brush in hand, a slip of bamboo before you. But today, you write not to record trade. You write to remember. Because the empire has shifted, and the toll gate no longer matters as it once did. For over 50 years, the western outposts flourished. Emperor Wu's expansionist policies turned the deserts of the Hexi corridor into veins of commerce and tribute. Soldiers, scholars, monks, and merchants passed through these gates. But dynastic fatigue now weighs on the realm. The Xiongnu have regrouped. The treasury is strained by wars and imperial extravagance. Political factions in Chang'an fight like dogs beneath the emperor's table. And in remote places like Yumenguan, the effect is felt in silence. Each month, fewer caravans arrive. Fewer messages come from the capital. And more clerks quietly disappear, transferred, retired, or simply forgotten. You have not received a direct order in 3 months. The last replacement ink shipment never arrived. You write with thin soot and desert water, and hope the register will still be legible. At the height of its power, the Han dynasty insisted that form was substance, that a properly stamped slip, a signed charter, a recorded toll, were equal in weight to a sword or a wagon of food. Now captains from the West arrive without paperwork. The grain is needed, they say, not the brush. You still record them, but they do not wait for your seal. They pass through, promising to file post facto. No one follows up. One day, you overhear 2 soldiers mocking your routine. Why does he still write everything? No one reads it. You don't reply, you simply record them too. They are now in the register, which means they existed. At least here. A new assistant arrives from Dunhuang Liang, a boy of 16, sharp-tongued and hurried. He asks, "Why do we log every mule? What's the point of nomming each merchant? Can't we just stamp them all at once?" You try to explain. Because history will not remember what wasn't recorded. He nods, says nothing, leaves early that day. Later, you find he has misfiled 5 entries, skipped weights, and copied the same toll amount for 3 unrelated caravans. You correct it quietly, with a red line and a sigh. You once believed that the system would outlive the clerks. Now you wonder if the clerks were the only thing holding it together. One morning, an official arrives on a fast horse, bearing a yellow edict scroll, the emperor's seal shimmering under layers of dust. He is curt and unreadable. "We are reducing postings. Gate operations are to be merged with Dunhuang. You may remain or return to Liangzhu. The post is symbolic only now." You ask, "And the register?" He shrugs, "Send it if you like. No one's reviewing them regularly." He rides off without waiting for your answer. You stare at the open road, then down at your logbook pages and pages of transactions, lives, trades, tolls. Symbolic. Like memory. You spend the next few days in ritual. You burn old notices. You stack scrolls by year. You mend the broken reed canopy. And you write a final entry. Today, the gate ceased to be a gate. It is now a place where memory waits. You tie the slips in bundles, secure them in oiled cloth, and bury them in a clay jar behind the toll house. You leave a note above the door. Register preserved beneath western wall. sealed in the year of Yunshu 6. If no one ever finds it, it will be as if this world never existed. But if they do, then maybe they'll know how the empire once measured its edges not in armies or walls, but in names, weights, and brushstrokes. You do not return to Liangzhu. You remain at the gate older, slower, watching caravans pass without permission, envoys ride without checks, goods flow without tolls. The empire continues, but differently now. And still you write. Not because it matters to anyone else, but because it mattered once. Because a civilization that forgets how it tracked its trade, marked its enemies, and named its travelers is a civilization preparing to fade. And because every time a camel passes through the gate, you are still the one who sees it, even if you are the last. Centuries later, archaeologists will find fragments of bamboo with faint hand characters, dates, weights, seals. The exact name of the clerk who wrote them will be lost. But someone will say, there was a gatekeeper here, and he recorded everything. And in that act of noticing, the forgotten toll clerk will be remembered again, if only briefly.